The Dominion Alliance had ruled the galaxy for approximately 7,000 standard cycles, which sounds impressive until you realize they'd spent at least 3,000 of those cycles just arguing about what to call themselves. The current name had won by a single vote, defeating the concordance of elevated beings in what historians would later describe as the most passive-aggressive election in recorded history. Their empire stretched across 47 star systems, encompassing 214 planets, and involved exactly 9 species who'd all independently discovered faster-than-light travel, immediately bumped into each other, and decided cooperation beat annihilation. Barely. The voting record suggested otherwise, but the official narrative was important for morale. The entire power structure rested on one delightfully simple principle: biometric scanning. Every species, every individual, radiated a measurable energy signature that corresponded directly to their physical capabilities, mental acuity, and most importantly, their capacity for violence. The Vorentine dominated the military with their baseline reading of the Helix Collective. Those perpetually smug telepaths clocked in at 923 units, and never let anyone forget it. The Ygritte, massive silicon-based juggernauts, topped the charts at 1,104 units, and used their position to secure the best trade routes, the most comfortable embassy chairs, and first dibs on newly discovered resource planets. This system had prevented exactly 4 wars, caused approximately 19 others, and generated enough bureaucratic paperwork to fill a small moon. But it worked, in the sense that everyone agreed to pretend it worked, which in galactic politics was essentially the same thing. The discovery of Sol 3, uninspired designation, but the intern who'd logged it had been on their 37th hour of shift, should have been routine. The Dominion's long-range survey vessels had cataloged approximately 6,000 primitive worlds, exhibiting early technological development. Most got a polite check back in a Millennium notation, and were left alone. The Alliance had standards, after all, and strip mining inhabited worlds was considered impolite after the incident with the Brunnix homeworld, that everyone agreed never to mention again. But Sol 3, which its inhabitants charmingly called Earth, presented an amusing anomaly. The initial scans detected nuclear fission, primitive spacecraft, and radio transmissions that consisted primarily of something called advertising, that the translation matrices struggled to classify as communication rather than psychological warfare. Fascinating, in an anthropological sort of way. The biometric readings, however, were hilarious. The dominant species registered at approximately 2.3 units. For context, the Ygritte's domesticated food animals scored higher at 4. The microscopic Flinny, whose entire civilization existed on colony ships because they'd never found a planet that didn't consider them a light snack, measured. Even the Dominion's most primitive client species, the Grolt, who'd only discovered fire 300 cycles ago, and still weren't entirely sure what to do with it, managed 15.6 units. 2.3 units meant this species could barely lift their own body weight. Their neural activity suggested intelligence, certainly, but the kind of intelligence that could maybe solve mathematical equations while being utterly incapable of backing it up with any meaningful physical presence. They were, in the professional assessment of the survey team's xenobiologist, cosmically adorable in their harmlessness. The Dominion Council debated the matter for approximately 14 minutes, a record for brevity, and decided to authorize a cultural assessment drone. Nothing invasive, just a small autonomous unit that would observe, record, and report back on whether these humans were worth formal contact in another 1,000 cycles or so. The drone would be equipped with full stealth capabilities, translation matrices, and enough sensor equipment to determine if humanity had anything interesting to offer, besides unintentional comedy. They selected a remote human outpost as the observation point, somewhere quiet away from the major population centers, where the drone could work undisturbed. The facility orbited a gas giant's moon, far enough from Earth proper, that any malfunction wouldn't cause interplanetary incident. The humans had labeled it Research Station Europa 7, which suggested they'd built at least 6 others, and were either optimistic or terrible at branding. The drone launched on a standard transport, arrived in system without incident, and activated its stealth field approximately 400,000 kilometers from the station. Standard procedure. The Alliance had performed this exact operation 6,000 times across the galaxy. The drone would observe for 30 cycles, compile its data, and return home with a comprehensive report that some mid-level bureaucrat would file under primitives. Not yet interesting, simple, routine, completely unremarkable. The universe, as it turned out, had other plans, and those plans involved work boots, maintenance schedules, and a complete misunderstanding of cosmic proportions that would restructure galactic civilization as thoroughly as any war. But that came later. First, someone had to actually step on the drone. The engineer's shift had started badly, and deteriorated from there with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for cascading system failures. The water reclamation unit in Section 7 had developed a rhythmic clanking that suggested imminent catastrophic failure. The atmospheric scrubbers were processing oxygen at 82% efficiency, which meant everyone got to enjoy that special barely enough air experience. And someone she had suspicions but no proof had finished the coffee without starting a new batch, which in her professional opinion constituted a war crime. Europa 7 housed exactly 43 humans, all of them scientists, engineers or support staff, who'd signed up for 18-month rotations studying subsurface ocean chemistry. The pay was excellent, the work was genuinely groundbreaking, and the isolation meant you either learned to fix things yourself, or you floated home in a body bag. She'd chosen to learn repair work, which seemed more practical than dying. The maintenance corridor in HAB Module 3 smelled like recycled air and desperation. She'd been chasing an electrical fault for 2 hours, following a trail of intermittent power fluctuations that made absolutely no sense according to the diagnostic readout. The panels insisted everything was functioning perfectly. The lights flickering every 47 seconds suggested the panels were lying. She rounded the corner near the auxiliary power junction, toolbox in one hand, and a scanning device that had given up providing useful information about 20 minutes ago. The fault had to be somewhere in this section. Unless the station's AI had developed a sense of humor and was messing with her, which seemed increasingly plausible. Something glinted on the floor near the junction box. Small, metallic, definitely not standard station equipment. Her first thought was debris. Maybe something had shaken loose during the last micrometeorite impact. Her second thought was that it looked vaguely insectoid, which was concerning because insects on Europa 7 meant someone had catastrophically failed quarantine protocol. She crouched down for a closer look. The object was roughly the size of her fist, covered in what appeared to be sensors or lenses, and was absolutely definitely not supposed to be here. It also seemed to be the source of her electrical readings, which meant it was interfering with station systems. Great, just fantastic. She reached out intending to pick it up and figure out what it was. The object moved, not much, just a slight repositioning, like it was observing, which was impossible, because station equipment didn't observe anything, it just sat there being equipment like it was supposed to. She pulled her hand back, frowning. Then her radio crackled with the shift supervisor's voice asking about her progress on the scrubber. She stood up to respond, distracted, and her boot came down squarely on the mysterious metallic object. There was a crunch, a distinctly unpleasant crunch, that suggested she'd just broken something expensive. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. She lifted her boot. The object was now significantly flatter than before, its sensor array cracked, various components scattered across the floor like mechanical confetti. Whatever it had been, it was definitely broken now. She'd have to file an incident report, figure out where it came from, and probably endure a very tedious lecture about paying attention to her surroundings. What she didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that the drone's final transmission had already left Europa's orbit, traveling faster than light toward Dominion space. What she definitely didn't know was the content of that transmission. Approximately 7 light-years away, the Dominion's monitoring station received the emergency signal and immediately escalated it to Priority 1 status. Priority 1 had been used exactly twice in recorded history, both times for species exhibiting catastrophic power signatures that threatened Alliance security. The drone's final readings were impossible, completely utterly impossible. The biometric signature had spiked from 2.3 units to over 247,000 units in the span of 0.0. This reading suggested something that could obliterate planets with casual gestures, render stars inert through sheer presence, and restructure reality as a hobby. The drone's AI had flagged it as an apex dominance display. The physical contact had been interpreted not as accidental crushing, but as a demonstration of overwhelming superiority. The readings suggested the being hadn't even used effort. The power signature indicated something operating at minimal capacity, barely acknowledging the drone's existence, while simultaneously demonstrating the ability to erase it from reality. The Emergency Council convened within minutes. 47 holographic representatives materialized in the chamber, their expressions ranging from terror to disbelief, to the peculiar calm that comes from accepting imminent death. "This cannot be accurate," the Helix Collective representative stated, their telepathic voice carrying undertones of panic they couldn't quite suppress. "These readings would make this species capable of conquering the entire Alliance in approximately 4 standard hours." The drone's systems were functioning perfectly until contact, the Vorantine military commander responded. "All diagnostics confirm accuracy. We're not looking at a malfunction. We're looking at a threat assessment. From a species we measured at 2. The Yargrith ambassador's silicon-based frame generated grinding sounds that translated roughly to incredulous laughter. "You're suggesting they've been hiding their capabilities." "I'm suggesting," the commander said carefully, "that our scanners measured what they were allowed to measure. What we just witnessed was one of them deciding to stop pretending." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that precedes civilizational upheaval. "Prepare the fleet," the council chair finally announced. "Full diplomatic protocols, maximum defensive posture, and for the love of entropy itself, do not give them any reason to demonstrate their capabilities again." Back on Europa 7, the engineer had swept up the debris, logged it as unidentified mechanical failure, and returned to fixing the atmospheric scrubber. She had 4 more hours left in her shift, and the coffee situation remained desperate. She had no idea that 63 warships were currently en route to her location, carrying enough firepower to sterilize a continent, and enough diplomatic representatives to negotiate humanity's entrance into galactic civilization. All because she'd had a bad day, and hadn't watched where she was walking. The Dominion fleet arrived in Sol system with all the subtlety of a supernova at a funeral. 63 vessels, each carrying enough weaponry to glass a small continent, dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation approximately 3 million kilometers from Europa. The formation had taken 6 hours to coordinate and represented the Alliance's most impressive display of military precision and collective anxiety. Every single ship had their shields at maximum capacity, weapons charged but not armed, and their communication arrays broadcasting on every conceivable frequency, a message that translated roughly to, "We come in peace, please don't obliterate us." The commander of the flagship, a Vorantine named Denth, who'd survived 4 actual wars and considered himself unflappable, was currently experiencing significant flapping. His primary hearts were operating at elevated rates, his combat instincts were screaming contradictory advice, and his diplomatic training was having a fistfight with his survival instincts. "Scan the station again," he ordered. "Full spectrum analysis. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with." The sensor operator's tendrils trembled as she manipulated the controls. "Commander, the readings they're back to baseline, 2.3 units across all detected humans. It's like nothing happened." "Which means they're hiding it again," the Helix Collective observer noted, confirming the hypothesis that they only reveal their true nature when demonstrating dominance. Denth resisted the urge to point out that this hypothesis was based on a single data point and terror-induced speculation. Instead, he straightened his combat harness and prepared to do something he'd never imagined in his worst tactical nightmares. Initiate first contact with a species that could apparently crush their technology, and possibly them without noticeable effort. Prepare the diplomatic shuttle. Minimum crew. Full ceremonial protocols. He paused, and someone send a message command. "If this goes badly, they should know it wasn't our fault." The engineer was elbow deep in the atmospheric scrubber's secondary filtration unit when the station's proximity alarms began screaming, not the polite chirping that indicated scheduled supply ships, but the full-blown wailing that suggested something very large and very unexpected had entered local space. She extracted herself from the machinery, leaving grease smears across her station jumpsuit, and pulled up the external camera feeds on her tablet. 63 alien spacecraft sat in perfect formation, each one large enough to make Europa 7 look like a child's toy. "Huh," she said, which under the circumstances demonstrated remarkable composure. The station's communication system crackled to life. All personnel. This is Director Hendricks. We have visitors, alien visitors. Everyone remain calm. Proceed to your duty stations and for God's sake somebody find the first contact protocols because I know we have them somewhere. The engineer looked at the grease on her hands, looked at the camera feed showing what was clearly a smaller craft detaching from the flagship, and made a command decision. She had approximately 15 minutes before that shuttle reached the station. The scrubbers needed another hour of work, minimum. The visitors would have to deal with suboptimal air quality, which seemed like a minor concern compared to the whole first contact with alien civilization situation. She washed her hands mostly and headed toward the main airlock. The diplomatic team consisted of 5 individuals representing the Alliance's most respected species. They wore full ceremonial regalia, carried translation matrices synchronized to 17,000 languages, and had rehearsed their greeting protocols 47 times during the shuttle flight. What they hadn't rehearsed was being greeted by a single human still wearing maintenance coveralls and carrying a half-empty coffee mug. The engineer hit the airlock release, and the diplomatic team filed into Europa 7's receiving bay with the kind of solemnity usually reserved for religious ceremonies or funerals. They arranged themselves in a careful hierarchy, tallest in back, most decorated in front, everyone trying to look simultaneously non-threatening and worthy of respect. The human took a sip from her mug, frowned and set it down on a nearby equipment crate. Right, she said. You folks need something? Because we're pretty busy with the atmospheric systems and if this isn't urgent, maybe we could schedule something for next week. The translation matrices worked frantically to process this. The words were simple enough, but the context was baffling. Was this a dominance ritual? Some form of verbal combat meant to establish hierarchy before formal negotiation? The lead diplomat, a Helix collective named Finath, who'd negotiated 17 successful treaties, stepped forward and executed a flawless bow, 3 seconds duration, 30-degree angle, hands positioned in the sign of peaceful intent. Honored Apex being, Finath began, his telepathic voice carefully modulated for maximum respect. We represent the Dominion Alliance, and come bearing acknowledgement of your species' clear superiority. We seek to establish peaceful relations and formally recognize humanity's rightful place. Hold on, the engineer interrupted. Apex, what now? Are you talking about the research station? Because we're just studying ice chemistry down here. Pretty boring stuff, honestly. The diplomatic team exchanged glances. This was clearly some form of ritualistic humility. The most powerful species often demonstrated their superiority through casual dismissal of their own capabilities. The texts were full of such examples. We understand your discretion, Finath continued carefully. However, our sensors detected your demonstration of power, the destruction of our observation drone. Oh, the engineer's expression shifted to understanding. Oh no, that was you guys. Listen, I'm really sorry about that. I thought it was some kind of equipment malfunction. I didn't mean to step on it. Is it expensive? Because I'll totally file a damage report. But honestly, our budget is pretty tight. So, she was offering to compensate them for their drone. After demonstrating the ability to generate a power signature equivalent to a stellar event, this was, Finath realized, either the most elaborate display of dominance he'd ever witnessed, or something had gone catastrophically wrong with everyone's understanding of the situation. Perhaps, he said slowly, we should start from the beginning. When you made physical contact with our observation unit, our sensors detected an energy signature of 247,000 units. This indicates capabilities far beyond anything in recorded galactic history. We came to formally acknowledge this, and negotiate humanity's entrance into galactic civilization, as a Tier 1 apex species. The engineer stared at him, then at the other diplomats, then back at Finath. You think I'm powerful? Because I stepped on your robe. The energy readings were unmistakable. I was wearing work boots, standard issue, they're like composite material with steel toes. Cost about $40 at the supply depot. The translation matrices struggled with $40 and settled on minimal resource expenditure, which somehow made it worse. Your equipment generates 247,000 units of energy, the Vorentine military attaché asked, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. My boot. The engineer picked up her coffee mug again, clearly needing it. No, they're just boots. Look, I don't know what your sensors detected, but I'm pretty sure you've got a calibration problem. I'm just an engineer. I fix air recyclers and patch hull breaches. I'm not, what did you call it? Apex anything. The diplomatic team stood in stunned silence as the implications crashed through their carefully constructed assumptions, like a meteor through tissue paper. They'd mobilized 63 warships, convened an emergency council, prepared surrender terms, and initiated first contact protocols with a species based on readings from a maintenance worker, stepping on a drone while distracted by coffee shortages. Meanwhile, in the station's command center, Director Hendricks was receiving panic transmissions from Earth governments, demanding to know why nobody had informed them about alien contact, what humanity's negotiating position should be, and whether the aliens were hostile, friendly, or just confused. Hendricks, watching the security feed from the airlock, suspected the answer was definitely confused, but that seemed like the kind of thing that required several more layers of bureaucracy to confirm. Back in the airlock, the engineer offered the only thing she could think of that seemed appropriate for the situation. Do you guys want some coffee? It's terrible, but it's caffeinated. The lead diplomat accepted, primarily because refusing seemed like it might trigger an interstellar incident, and took a careful sip from the offered container. The liquid was bitter, acidic, and possibly qualified as a chemical weapon under Dominion regulations. Finath searched for diplomatic phrasing. It's definitely caffeinated. Told you it was terrible, the engineer said cheerfully. Now about those sensors of yours. You want me to take a look? Because honestly, 247,000 units. Sounds like a pretty serious malfunction. And that was how humanity's first contact evolved into a technical support call, with alien diplomats trying to explain their scanner technology, while a maintenance engineer offered troubleshooting advice, and absolutely terrible coffee. The galaxy's power structure was collapsing in real time, and nobody had even finished their first cup. The Emergency Scientific Symposium, convened aboard the Dominion flagship, approximately 6 hours after what historians would later call the incident of profound miscalculation. 14 of the Alliance's finest scientific minds had assembled, along with 3 increasingly exhausted human scientists from Europa 7, and enough recording equipment to document what promised to be either a breakthrough in understanding, or a collective nervous breakdown. The engineer, who'd been politely but firmly escorted to the flagship, after offering to just check the calibration real quick, sat at the conference table still wearing her maintenance coveralls. She'd brought her coffee mug. The aliens had learned not to comment on it. Let's establish baseline facts, the Yogrith lead scientist began, his crystalline voice carrying the weight of someone whose entire worldview had shattered in the past standard cycle. Our biometric scanners measure energy output across 17 different spectra. They've been calibrated against 9 species, and tested on 6,000 primitive worlds. The technology is sound. Sure, the engineer agreed. But have you ever tested them on humans before? Silence. Right. So maybe they're just not designed for our biology. Like different species probably radiate energy differently. Yeah? A Helix Collective physicist leaned forward, their telepathic presence carefully neutral. Our scanners measure universal constants. Energy is energy regardless of biological origin. The readings should be consistent. Okay, but hear me out. The engineer pulled up a schematic on her tablet. Your scanner here, this is measuring electromagnetic signatures, thermal output, neural activity, and some other stuff I don't recognize. What's this frequency band? Psionic resonance, the physicist explained. Mental energy output. It's how we measure neural capacity. Right. And this one? Gravitational field distortion, physical mass and density. The engineer nodded slowly, her expression shifting from confused to thoughtful to something approaching horrified understanding. Oh no, I think I see the problem. Every alien in the room leaned forward. You're measuring everything, aren't you? Like everything, not just biological output, but environmental interaction, kinetic transfer, electromagnetic interference. Yes, the Yogrith scientist confirmed. That's how we achieve accurate readings. The the total energy signature of an organism in its environment, including what the organism is wearing. Pause. Clothing doesn't generate significant. My boots have steel toes. The engineer interrupted. Steel, ferromagnetic material. When I stepped on your drone, I wasn't just applying physical pressure. I was creating a localized electromagnetic anomaly, because your drone was broadcasting on approximately 40 different frequencies, and my boots basically turned me into a walking magnetic field. Disruptor. She pulled up another schematic. Plus, Europa 7 sits in Jupiter's magnetosphere. We're constantly bathed in radiation that our shielding deflects. When I moved, I probably created a cascade effect. Kinetic energy, electromagnetic interference, thermal signature from my body heat, meeting your drone's cooling systems, neural activity from me being annoyed about the scrubbers, and your sensors tried to interpret all of it as a unified power signature. The physicist's telepathic presence flickered with something that might have been embarrassment. If telepathic species could feel embarrassment, which they absolutely could, and were definitely feeling now. You're suggesting, the Yogrith scientist said slowly, that our reading of 247,000 units was environmental interference compounded by equipment interaction. I'm suggesting your scanner had a spectacular freakout when it encountered variables it wasn't designed to handle, the engineer corrected. Though honestly, the fact that nobody tested these things on humans before deploying them seems like an oversight. We measured you at 2.3 units originally, the Vorentine representative pointed out. That reading was consistent with primitives incapable of spaceflight. Yeah, about that. One of the other human scientists, an exobiologist, who'd been quietly reviewing data, spoke up. Your scanners are measuring all the wrong things for humans. We're not powerful in the way you define power. We're endurance-based persistence hunters, who learn to manipulate our environment, instead of adapting to it. Our energy signatures are low because we're efficient, not weak. She pulled up comparative biological data. Your species, all of you, evolved on worlds where physical strength determines survival. Your bodies generate massive energy signatures, because that's how you interact with your environment. Humans evolved to outlast everything, through sheer stubborn refusal to die. We sweat. We track prey for days. We throw things with terrifying accuracy. We're not strong, we're relentless. And your technology, the Helix Collective physicist asked, compensates for everything we're terrible at. The exobiologist continued. We can't survive temperature extremes, so we built climate control. We can't breathe in space, so we built life support. We're not particularly fast, strong or durable compared to other Earth predators, so we built tools. Your scanners measure biological output. They're not measuring the fact that we've turned environmental manipulation into an art form. The implications settled over the conference room like a lid blanket. So we mobilized 63 warships. Commander Denth said quietly, prepared surrender terms, and initiated first contact protocols, because of a scanner malfunction caused by work boots and magnetic interference. Pretty much, yeah, the engineer confirmed. She took a sip of coffee, though honestly, the overreaction is kind of flattering. Terrifying, but flattering. The Dominion scientists spent the next 4 hours running every test they could devise on the human volunteers, who cooperated with the patience of people who'd realized they were now representing their entire species, and couldn't afford to be difficult. The results confirmed the worst-case scenario from the Alliance's perspective. Their entire civilization's power structure was based on sensor technology that didn't work properly on humans. So what's our actual reading? The engineer finally asked. If your scanners were calibrated correctly. The Yogrith scientist checked his recalibrated equipment. Approximately 43 units, significantly higher than your original 2.3, but nowhere near apex level. Your average, solidly average by Dominion standards.
Huh?
The engineer considered this. Could have been worse. Could have been accurate from the beginning. Commander Denth muttered, thinking about the reports he'd have to file and the 63 ship captains who'd have to explain to their crews why they'd mobilized for a false alarm. 3 standard cycles later, the Dominion Council formally invited humanity to join the Alliance as a probationary member species, not as apex conquerors, but as what the official documentation carefully termed, technologically proficient environmental specialists. The vote passed unanimously, mostly because everyone was too embarrassed to object.
The Treaty of Europa, named after the station where everything had gone magnificently wrong, established humanity's place in galactic civilization. With terms that were surprisingly generous, the Alliance needed what humans were good at: engineering solutions to impossible problems, persistence in the face of overwhelming odds, and an apparent immunity to giving up when any sensible species would surrender. Also, the coffee. Several species had acquired a taste for the terrible beverage, though the Helix Collective maintained it violated 3 different chemical weapon treaties, and should be classified accordingly. The engineer returned to Europa 7, after the negotiations concluded, turned down approximately 17 diplomatic positions, and went back to fixing atmospheric scrubbers. She did, however, keep the commemorative plaque the Dominion had presented her, a formal acknowledgement of her role in facilitating humanity's entrance into galactic society, through demonstration of technical proficiency and cultural exchange. The plaque hung in her quarters, next to a framed photo of her work boots, which she'd retired from service but couldn't quite bring herself to throw away. They'd conquered the galaxy after all. Sort of, accidentally, through catastrophic sensor malfunction and electromagnetic interference. The galaxy's hierarchy had been upended not by military might or psionic supremacy, but by a maintenance worker having a bad day and not watching where she walked. The footprint she'd left on the Dominion's drone, preserved now in the Alliance historical archives, became a symbol of humanity's entry into galactic civilization. A reminder that power came in forms the universe hadn't evolved to measure, and that sometimes the most dangerous species was the one that simply refused to register as dangerous. The Dominion updated their scanner technology, added 17 new calibration protocols specifically for humans in environmental interference. The update documentation, running to approximately 4,000 pages, included a single footnote that would become legendary among xenobiologists. When measuring primitives, account for the possibility that they've compensated for biological limitations through technological innovation. Also, check for ferromagnetic footwear. Commander Denth retired 6 cycles later, having successfully navigated the most embarrassing first contact in Dominion history, without starting a war. He wrote a memoir that became required reading at the military academy. The final chapter was titled, "Why You Should Always Calibrate Your Sensors Properly," and included a picture of a steel-toed work boot. The engineer, when asked about her role in galactic history, usually just shrugged and said she'd been trying to fix the air recyclers, and would people please stop making such a big deal about it. She had work to do, the coffee was still terrible, and someone had to keep Europa 7 running while everyone else panicked about alien civilizations and diplomatic protocols. Her footprint remained in the archives, a size 8 work boot impression in crushed sensor equipment, marking the moment when humanity stumbled into galactic civilization, through sheer accidental chaos and electromagnetic interference. The universe had expected conquerors. It got maintenance workers with coffee dependency and practical problem-solving skills. Somehow that turned out to be significantly more terrifying.